Welcome back, my friends, to Faces of History, the show where we brush aside polite myths and stare straight into the unvarnished eyes of the giants who carved America with iron fists, burning coal, and raw ambition. I'm your host, the Duke of New York, and tonight we're taking a steam-powered ride into the Gilded Age, a time of robber barons and railroads, backroom deals and bribes, fortunes stacked so high they reshaped the land under their feet. And at the center of it all, one man, one name, Cornelius Vanderbilt. They called him the Commodore, a man who started with a single boat in New York Harbor and built a transportation empire that connected a nation. A man so ruthless in business that his rivals called him a pirate in a top hat, and his friends just called him rich. So pour yourself something stiff, you're going to need it, and climb aboard. Because tonight we ride the rails and steamships of Cornelius Vanderbilt's America. Let's wind the clock all the way back before the railroads, before the steamships, before Wall Street whispered the Commodore's name like a curse in a prayer. Let's meet the boy who would bend America's rivers and rails to his will. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born on May 27th, 1794, in Port Richmond, Staten Island, New York, back when Staten Island was more farmland than ferry stop. His people were Dutch, old stock, old soil, old stubborn grit. His father, Cornelius Sr., scratched out a living as a farmer and a boatman, ferrying produce and people between Staten Island and Manhattan. Their house was small, perched near the harbor's edge, where salty wind and brackish tide were constant companions. Little Cornelius wasn't born with a silver spoon. He was born with salt spray in his face and mud on his boots. By all accounts, young Cornelius was rough, wiry, and restless. He wasn't a scholar, not by a long shot. School, he hated it. Letters and ledgers were chores to him. He wanted the bay, the docks, the smell of tar and rope and brine. He wanted something bigger than books. He wanted to move. At 11 years old, he dropped out of school for good. Not an unusual story for a poor farm kid in the early republic. But the difference was, Cornelius didn't want to till fields or muck out stalls like his neighbors. He wanted the water. At 16, Cornelius made his first real stand against the tides of poverty. He convinced his mother to loan him $100, a fortune to the Vanderbilts. He promised he'd pay her back with profit. He took that $100 and bought himself a periauger, a kind of flat-bottom sailboat, small enough to haul cargo, but sturdy enough to run people and goods across the chop between Staten Island and Manhattan. He named it Swiftsure. Bold name for a bold boy. And just like that, young Cornelius Vanderbilt was in business. His first routes were simple, ferrying farmers' produce, livestock, and sometimes passengers. He'd wake before dawn, hitch his sails in the gray light, and push out onto New York Harbor's restless water. It was dangerous work. The tides could flip a small boat in seconds, storms could smash you against the piers, ice could trap you mid-crossing. But Cornelius loved it. He worked the boat himself, leaning into wind and current. He was a big-boned kid, strong-backed, quick to scrap with other boatmen who tried to undercut his prices. He was unpolished, foul-mouthed, aggressive. The city folks called him that Staten Island wild boy. But he didn't care what they called him. He was making money, his way. By the time he turned 20, Vanderbilt had repaid his mother's loan many times over. He wasn't content to just scrape by. He cut his prices so low that bigger ferry operators hated him. But the farmers loved him, and so did the immigrants and dock workers who needed to cross the harbor cheap. Legend has it, when rival boatmen threatened him, he threatened them right back. Fists first, then his prices. If they dropped fares, he'd drop his lower. If they muscled him on the docks, he'd meet them at dawn with his fists and a grin. He earned the nickname the Commodore early on, partly as a joke about his ragged little fleet, partly because people sensed even then that this Staten Island farm boy thought and fought like an admiral. So what made him different? What made this rough kid with no fancy schooling and no wealthy backers outfight and outhustle grown men twice his age? Part of it was raw work ethic. Cornelius was tireless, up before sunrise, hauling goods himself, bargaining directly with customers. But it was more than sweat. It was instinct. He had a sixth sense for money, where it hid, how it moved, how to squeeze more out of a tide, a cargo, a contract. And from the very beginning, he learned the golden lesson that would shape every deal he ever made. If you cut out the middleman and run your own show, nobody takes a slice of your pie but you. By 25, the boy from Staten Island wasn't just a boatman, he was a businessman. He was already looking beyond the harbor, like out to the rivers, the coastlines, the places steam would soon reach. Steam, that was the future. And Cornelius Vanderbilt planned to grab it by the throat and ride it all the way to the top. So, picture it. The young Cornelius Vanderbilt, barely 25, rough hands on the tiller of his little sailboat, pockets stuffed with cash and IOUs, eyes locked on the future. He's beaten the odds on the harbor, undercut the older ferry captains, won brawls on the docks and in the courts. But the world is about to change, and Cornelius smells it in the salt air. It's the dawn of the steam age. In the early 1800s, steam power was still young, loud, unpredictable. Robert Fulton's Clermont made its first run up the Hudson River in 1807. People called it Fulton's Folly, until that clattering paddle wheel pulled against the current and didn't stop. By the time Vanderbilt was hauling produce across the harbor, steamships were the new wonder. Faster than sails, stronger than wind, free from the mercy of the tides. Cornelius didn't invent the steamboat, but he knew what to do with it. In 1817, he sold his periaugers and sailboats and went to work for Thomas Gibbons, a hot-tempered entrepreneur with a grudge against the powerful steamboat monopoly of the day, the one run by Robert Fulton's old partner, Robert Livingston. You see, back then, New York gave Fulton and Livingston an exclusive right to run steamboats on its waters. If you wanted to run your own, tough luck. Pay up or prepare to get sued into the ground. But Gibbons didn't like paying up. He needed a captain, a fighter, someone reckless enough to run illegal steamboat routes from New Jersey to New York and poke a stick in the monopoly's eye. Enter Cornelius Vanderbilt. The Eague of New York, Vanderbilt became Gibbons' captain, business manager, enforcer, all rolled into one. He ran the Bellona, Gibbons' prized steamboat, back and forth between New Brunswick and Manhattan. He broke the rules every single day, thumbing his nose at Fulton and Livingston's lawyers and anyone else who tried to block the dock. When rival captains tried to run him off the rivers, Vanderbilt rammed them. When inspectors came sniffing around for bribes or tickets, Vanderbilt ran his boats faster, leaner, cheaper. He was famous for dropping fares so low that passengers would ride for pennies. He didn't care about profit in the short run. He cared about crushing his enemies. This wasn't just a boat race, this was open economic warfare. Vanderbilt learned something during this guerrilla ferry campaign that stuck with him for life. When you can't beat the monopoly in court, beat it on the water. Make the monopoly too expensive to keep alive. And it worked. Gibbons v. Ogden. Maybe you remember that case from your old civics class. The fight between Gibbons and the Fulton-Livingston monopoly went all the way to the Supreme Court. In 1824, the court ruled that only the federal government could regulate interstate commerce, not states handing out monopoly rights like candy. That ruling opened up America's rivers to competition, and Cornelius Vanderbilt was the man waiting at the docks, ready to steam ahead. After the monopoly broke, Vanderbilt didn't hang around as someone else's hired gun for long. He struck out on his own, his steamboats, his routes, his money on the line. He ran boats up the Hudson to Albany, down the Atlantic coast, into Long Island Sound. He cut fares so low it forced older operators to sell him their ships at a loss or go bankrupt trying to keep up. People hated him. They called him a pirate, a cheat, a bully in a stovepipe hat. But passengers loved him. They could get from New York to Providence for a fraction of the old price, faster, safer, with a brash young captain who promised he'd sink a rival before he'd surrender a customer. He earned every dime, every scar, every insult. He raced rival captains head-to-head through fog, ice, and storms. Once, legend says, he ordered his pilot to hold course in a steamboat duel on Long Island Sound, refusing to yield even when the other boat nearly clipped his paddle wheel. They missed each other by inches. Vanderbilt just laughed, lit his cigar, and told his crew, "Next time, we'll cut him in half." By the time he was 40, Vanderbilt was one of the richest men on the East Coast, all thanks to his iron will, his iron hulls, and his refusal to bow to the so-called gentlemen who thought they owned the rivers. But the Commodore was far from done. He looked west, to the great iron roads being laid from city to city. He saw that the same logic of steam and speed could cross land the way it crossed water. He'd broken the ferry monopoly. He'd beaten the steam kings. Now he'd do the same to the railroads, and he'd do it on a scale that would make the old robber barons look like amateurs. Next, we'll ride with Vanderbilt into the wild world of iron rails, political bribes, cutthroat stock wars, and a fortune so vast it would shape New York City for generations. So take a breath, top off that glass. The Commodore's empire is just getting warmed up. All right, my friends, refill that drink, stretch your legs, and lean back in your chair because our Staten Island boat boy is about to level up. When we last left Cornelius Vanderbilt, he'd smashed the Hudson River monopoly, humiliated the old steamboat lords, and built a name that dock workers spat and whispered in the same breath. But for Vanderbilt, running ferries between Staten Island and Manhattan was just training wheels. He wanted something bigger, ocean-sized. In the 1830s and 1840s, the United States was exploding outward. The East Coast was crowded with steam ferries, but beyond lay vast coastal routes. New York to Charleston, New Orleans, Havana, places where steamships could haul cotton, passengers, mail, and gold faster than any wind-powered vessel ever could. Vanderbilt saw a gap, and gaps to him were veins of gold waiting to be mined. He built bigger steamships, iron-hulled leviathans bristling with paddle wheels and smoke-belching stacks. He didn't just stick to calm rivers. He pushed his ships down the Atlantic coast, into the Caribbean, across stormy seas that ate wooden ships for breakfast. His captains were handpicked. His crews? Tough men who could outrun storms and rival shipmasters alike. And he demanded everything of them: speed, nerve, and loyalty. Vanderbilt had no patience for slackers. If a captain made him look slow or foolish, he was fired by sundown. But where the Commodore really made a killing was during the California Gold Rush. Picture it. 1849, gold discovered at Sutter's Mill. Tens of thousands of fortune hunters scrambling to get from New York to San Francisco before all the nuggets got scooped up. Problem? There was no transcontinental railroad yet. The only way west was to sail around South America, a dangerous months-long voyage, or cut across the deadly jungles of Panama. Vanderbilt sniffed the opportunity like a wolf on a warm scent. He launched his Nicaragua route, a cunning shortcut. Passengers boarded his steamships in New York, sailed down to Nicaragua's Atlantic coast, crossed the narrow isthmus on riverboats and mule trails, then caught another Vanderbilt steamer waiting on the Pacific side. It was risky, sure. Jungles, snakes, bandits, tropical diseases, but it was faster. And faster meant more passengers, more gold, more millions flowing straight into Vanderbilt's iron safe. Like the mighty Pacific Mail Steamship Company, howled that Vanderbilt was cheating them out of a monopoly on the Panama route. They tried to buy him off. They tried to muscle him out. They even bribed Nicaraguan officials to revoke his passage rights. Vanderbilt's answer? Cut fares to the bone. Run bigger, faster ships. Use bribery of his own if he had to. And a move that would echo through the dirty corridors of capitalism forever. When partners betrayed him, he crushed them mercilessly. One famous feud was with Charles Morgan and Cornelius Garrison, two of his managers who tried to steal his Nicaragua route out from under him. Vanderbilt's legendary line? "Gentlemen, you have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for the law is too slow. I'll ruin you." And ruin them he did, re-entering the route himself, outpricing them until their stolen company begged for mercy. He made millions, lost millions, made them back double. The Commodore didn't fear losing money, because to him, money was just ammunition for the next fight. By the 1850s, Cornelius Vanderbilt was more than a boatman. He was the undisputed king of the coastal steam lanes. He controlled routes from New York to San Francisco, New Orleans to Havana. He'd made so much money that he didn't even need to raise fares. Instead, he squeezed out every rival by sheer brute force and better efficiency. He built faster steamers than the U.S. Navy. He even offered to donate one of his biggest ships, the Vanderbilt, to the Union during the Civil War at his own expense. He was a patriot when it suited him and a ruthless capitalist when it didn't. The Duke of New York. Yet for all his oceanic conquests, the Commodore knew that steamships alone were only half the future. The other half was rolling across the American continent on iron rails. The same lessons he'd learned in the ferry wars, the river wars, and the sea lanes. cut costs, break monopolies, crush your enemies without blinking. He'd bring to the railroads next. And that's where he'd leave his deepest mark, in the steel veins that stitched America together from ocean to ocean. So next up, we're riding the rails. From New York to Chicago, through bribed politicians, stock raids, and the making of a dynasty so vast that the Vanderbilt name would echo in marble mansions for generations. So pour another drink. This is where the Commodore trades salt spray for steel rails and becomes a legend that Wall Street still whispers about. All right, my friends, the sails are furled, the paddle wheels docked, but Cornelius Vanderbilt isn't done conquering America. He's just changing vehicles. He's about to ride iron rails, and anyone standing on the tracks had better step aside. It's the 1860s. America is stitched together by rivers, canals, and dirt roads, but the real veins of power now? Railroads. Iron tracks that run west through forests, farmland, mountains. Whoever controls the rails controls the flow of coal, cattle, wheat, oil, and money. And the Commodore, sitting in his Fifth Avenue mansion, sees the future chugging toward him in a cloud of steam and soot. See, Vanderbilt was already rich, filthy rich. By 1863, he was pushing 70 years old. Most men his age would have been content to count their steamship millions, sip brandy, and let their sons handle the family business. But not Cornelius Vanderbilt. He'd never trusted the stock market gamblers who ran New York's railroads. He saw them as weak men in silk hats, parasites who made fortunes shuffling paper instead of hauling freight. He believed the future belonged to men who owned things: ships, tracks, stations, locomotives. Assets you could touch, control, defend with lawyers and fists if you had to. So he decided to buy the rails outright. His first big play? The New York and Harlem Railroad. It ran up Manhattan and out into the countryside, a modest line, but perfectly positioned to connect with bigger routes. Vanderbilt bought shares quietly, then not so quietly. When rival speculators tried to corner the stock and freeze him out, he taught them a lesson they never forgot. The Commodore simply kept buying. He squeezed the short sellers until they bled. When they couldn't deliver the shares they'd promised, boom, they had to buy them back at Vanderbilt's price or go broke trying. Some called it manipulation. Vanderbilt called it business. Next, he set his sights on the mighty Hudson River Railroad. This was the main artery linking New York City to Albany, the gateway to the Great Lakes and the booming Midwest beyond. Vanderbilt made his move just as the Civil War was ripping the country apart. While other investors panicked, he stayed steady, buying, consolidating, tightening his grip. By 1864, he owned the Harlem and the Hudson. And with those two lines, he had the keys to the Empire State. But he wasn't done. He wanted the grand prize, the New York Central Railroad. This wasn't just any line. This was the spinal cord of the entire Northeast rail system. It connected Manhattan to Buffalo, Niagara Falls, and beyond. Whoever controlled the Central could dictate rates for farm goods, coal, and people traveling between the East Coast and the breadbasket. Vanderbilt started swallowing up Central stock, quietly at first, then with all the subtlety of a steam locomotive smashing through a fence. And that's when the sharks smelled blood, the infamous Erie War. It was Vanderbilt versus the slickest con men on Wall Street, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk. If Vanderbilt was the old-school street brawler of capitalism, Gould and Fisk were the smooth-talking knife fighters who'd gut you while buying you dinner. Here's how it went down. Vanderbilt wanted the Erie Railroad too, a crucial line running west through New York State. Gould and Fisk wanted it for themselves. So they did something brilliant and crooked. They printed thousands of shares of fake Erie stock overnight, flooding the market to dilute Vanderbilt's holdings and stop his takeover. Vanderbilt found himself holding worthless paper. His millions turned to mud. Furious, he sued. He bribed judges. Fisk and Gould bribed bigger judges. It was chaos. Bags of cash changing hands in back rooms, courtrooms jammed with Vanderbilt's lawyers screaming fraud. Did he win? Not this round. Gould and Fisk slipped out the back door with the Erie, giggling all the way, but they knew better than to cross the Commodore again. Vanderbilt didn't forget or forgive, and he made sure their future tricks never hit him the same way twice. His real victory wasn't Erie. It was the New York Central. He secured it, merged it with his Hudson River line, and forged a single iron artery from Manhattan clear to Chicago. No more breakpoints, No more rival companies to undercut him at every junction. He called it the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad, a steel empire that could haul millions of tons of freight and passengers across half a continent at his command. Vanderbilt understood he was laying down steel rails that would outlast him. He poured millions into Grand Central Depot, the predecessor of today's Grand Central Terminal. He didn't just want to run the trains. He wanted to own the place where the entire city came to board them. By the time the Commodore was done, he had made more money moving freight and people over iron rails than he ever did over churning waves. He was old, tired, famously unpolished, but he was the king of the railroads. He smashed rivals, rewrote business law, bent legislatures to his will, and made enemies out of men who would become tycoons themselves. Some called him a robber baron, others a genius of efficiency who modernized American transportation. And when he finally laid down his cane and top hat for the last time, he left behind not just tracks and stations, but a dynasty of wealth so huge that his grandchildren would build marble mansions in Newport and Fifth Avenue palaces just to have something to do with all that Vanderbilt gold. So next, my friends, we'll ride this iron horse to its final stop, the last years of the Commodore, the family feuds, the epic fortune, and the ghost of a man who changed the way America moves forever. Top off that drink, because when it comes to the Commodore's last battles, the enemy was his own blood. All right, gather close, my friends, because if you thought Cornelius Vanderbilt fought hard against rivals like Daniel Drew or Jay Gould, wait till you hear what happened when the enemy wasn't in a boardroom, but around his own dinner table. By the time the Commodore hit his 70s, he was worth more than $100 million. Adjust that for inflation, and you're talking about billions today. A fortune so vast it dwarfed the federal budget of the United States at the time. It's no exaggeration to say Vanderbilt was America's first true tycoon. But there's a strange curse about vast wealth. You can crush every rival on the waterfront, break monopolies, and buy entire legislatures, but you can't buy peace at home. Cornelius had 13 children with his first wife, Sophia Johnson, a tough, deeply religious woman who weathered his explosive temper and the smell of salt and coal dust on his clothes for decades. But the Commodore's patience for his children? Practically zero. He believed in strength, hustle, brains. And in his eyes, most of his kids came up short. He called them drones, lazy, spoiled, soft from the comfort he'd carved out with his iron fists. He especially distrusted his sons. Some dabbled in politics, some tried shipping on their own, some just partied away his money and embarrassed the family name. Vanderbilt was famous for saying he'd rather leave his fortune to his horses than to some useless heir who didn't understand the value of a dollar. There was one exception: William Henry Vanderbilt, his quiet, dutiful son. While the Commodore's other boys gambled, William quietly ran the Staten Island Railroad lines, managed payroll, studied ledgers, and learned the empire's secrets. He did it without swagger. To his father, that counted for everything. When the old man was too frail to stomp the rail yards himself, it was William Henry he trusted with the keys to the castle. But even then, the Commodore didn't make it easy. He called William blubber behind his back, teased him for being soft, questioned whether he had the backbone to handle the vultures on Wall Street. He tested him constantly. And when William proved he could break rivals and cut costs just like his father, the Commodore finally, grudgingly called him worthy. But the family drama didn't stop there. Cornelius's extended clan hated William for being the favorite. Lawsuits flew even before the Commodore's coffin closed. His daughters, who'd married wealthy men of their own, wanted bigger cuts. Nieces, nephews, all elbowing for a slice of that mountain of gold. The Commodore's final will read like a battlefield map. When it was opened in 1877, it revealed that of his enormous fortune, the vast bulk, around $95 million, went straight to William. The other children? They got crumbs by comparison, enough to be rich by normal standards, but pocket change next to the family's mountain of railroad steel and steamship gold. They were furious. Some tried to contest the will in court, accusing William of manipulating their aging father. They called Cornelius senile, a claim that anyone who'd ever faced him in a stock corner could laugh right out of the courtroom. But bitterness lingered, and so did lawsuits. But while the family fought, William Henry Vanderbilt did what his father trained him to do: expand. If Cornelius laid the tracks, William built the locomotives that would run America for the next generation. He doubled the family fortune in just a few short years, proving that sometimes a blubber can be every bit as ruthless as the Commodore himself. Of course, there were enemies outside the family, too. Men like Jay Gould, the same trickster who'd humiliated Vanderbilt with the Erie War, was still lurking, now looking to squeeze railroads in the West. New railroad tycoons were rising. James J. Hill, Edward Harriman, all taking notes from the Commodore's playbook. But here's the twist. Cornelius didn't care much about being liked. He didn't donate vast sums to charity like Carnegie would do later. He didn't build libraries like Rockefeller. His legacy was concrete and cold steel, miles of track, tunnels through mountains, Grand Central Depot towering over New York like a steam and stone temple to his ambition. He left the nation richer, more connected, but not necessarily kinder. To his rivals, he was a pirate with a boardroom. To his admirers, he was the engine that dragged America out of its sleepy colonial past and into an industrial future. And to his family, he was the ghost they couldn't escape, the standard none of them could quite live up to, though they spent their lives trying. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877 at age 82, they buried him in a massive granite tomb in Staten Island, the same place where he'd started ferrying farmers across the bay for a few coins. He left behind more than money. He left behind a lesson that in America, fortune favors the brutal as much as the brilliant, that behind every marble mansion is a foundation poured with someone else's sweat, and that every gilded name you see on a skyscraper today, somewhere in its DNA is Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore who turned boats and rails into an empire. So next, my friends, pour yourself one more, because we'll ride this story all the way to its final switch. How Vanderbilt's fortune outlived him, how his heirs built castles and burned bridges, and how his legacy still rumbles under our feet every time a train screams down the tracks. All right, gather round, my friends, because we're rolling into the last stretch of track laid by Cornelius Vanderbilt. And you might think, surely the Commodore, master of steam and steel, king of rivers and rails, went out in comfort, a mellow old man enjoying his riches. You'd be wrong. Vanderbilt was never one to grow soft in his rocking chair. His final years were a collision of age, ambition, family feuds, and a mind that never really slept. By the 1870s, Vanderbilt was an old man in a young country. He was the living embodiment of America's rise, born just after the Revolution, died when America was sprinting headlong into the Gilded Age. But time was taking its pound of flesh. His health declined, his hearing faded, his once bullish frame stooped under the weight of decades at sea and years hunched over ledgers and legal battles. But even as his body betrayed him, his mind stayed sharp, dangerously sharp. He still barked orders at clerks, still demanded reports on rail profits and passenger traffic. He still prowled his Fifth Avenue mansion in New York, a city that now pulsed with the hum of his trains. Here's a man who once roared down Manhattan's dirt roads in a horse cart, just to prove he was faster than his rivals. Now he watched the city grow around him. Grand Central Depot, thrumming with commuters who probably didn't even know they owed their morning ride to the Commodore's relentless will. His evenings were filled with visitors, not friends, mind you, but lawyers, stock speculators, railroad men, and his own children trying to secure their slices of his legacy before the final curtain fell. His second wife, Frank Armstrong Crawford, nearly 45 years younger, tended to him as much as he allowed. Frank was no docile trophy wife. She had a spine of steel herself. Some said she soothed the Commodore's rough edges in his last years, even convinced him to make small charitable donations, like the founding of Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, one of the few philanthropic acts he ever bothered with. But don't think that made him a saint. It was small compared to the vast ocean of wealth he hoarded. And then there were the endless disputes. Vanderbilt's children hovered like crows. They feared two things: the Commodore dying, and the Commodore living long enough to cut them out of the will entirely. He was known to threaten disinheriting any child who crossed him. He disowned one son outright for unfilial conduct. His daughters pleaded for better settlements. Some went to court. Vanderbilt sneered. He'd built this fortune himself. He wasn't about to watch it vanish into the soft hands of idle heirs who'd never swung a sledgehammer or sailed through a storm. Even as he lay sick, Vanderbilt remained obsessed with business. He worked deals from his bed. He read ledgers by lamplight while his lungs gave out. His rivals and friends alike watched in awe. This old pirate, refusing to dock until death took the rudder. On January 4th, 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, finally closed his eyes for good. Cause of death? Chronic exhaustion, they said. Maybe so. When you fight everyone your whole life, the ocean, the courts, your children, the one fight you can't win is with the ticking clock. His funeral? Massive. Carriages lined Fifth Avenue. The city's elite, bankers, railroad barons, politicians, filed past the coffin, bowing their heads to the man who'd bent Wall Street to his will more than once. Ministers spoke of a titan who modernized America. The press printed the final tally, $100 million, the single largest personal fortune amassed in America to that date. And as the family filed into the Vanderbilt Mausoleum on Staten Island, you can bet they were already planning the next battles. Who gets what? Who stays on the board? How do we keep this mountain of steel and steam intact? The Commodore's story didn't end with the lowering of that heavy stone lid. His money lived on, in the marble mansions of his grandsons and great-grandsons, in the railroads that crisscrossed America like steel veins, in the skyline of New York, where Grand Central still hums with the ghosts of porters, locomotives, and the iron-fisted man who built it. He was gone, but the world he forged kept roaring. So, my friends, next time you pass a freight train screaming down the tracks, or you stand under the vaulted ceiling of Grand Central Terminal, remember, that echo of thunder, that faint whistle, that's the Commodore, still moving cargo, passengers, and fortunes long after his bones turned to dust. He left behind an empire, and he left behind a lesson, that America was never tamed by the polite or the patient. It was bent into shape by men too stubborn to stay in their lane. And that, my friends, is Cornelius Vanderbilt, steam king, rail emperor, the Gilded Age on two legs. Stick around because when you're ready, I'll pull us into the final station, how the Vanderbilt name became a byword for obscene wealth, and how even that couldn't stop time from swallowing it up. Let's settle in for the final stretch of the Commodore's wild ride, the part where we ask the question that lingers long after the man is gone. All right, my friends, pour that final drink and lean in close, because when the steam clears, the whistle fades, and the Commodore's bones lie quiet in Staten Island granite, we're left with the biggest question of all. What did Cornelius Vanderbilt really leave behind? Was he America's great builder, the muscle and grit that laid down the tracks that stitched a young nation together? Or was he just the meanest bully on the block? A man who crushed rivals, undercut prices, bribed politicians, and sneered at charity while stacking coins to the ceiling. Let's weigh the ledger. On the builder's side, the case is pretty clear. Vanderbilt changed everything. Before him, America's coasts and rivers were choked with overpriced, unreliable ferries run by petty monopolies and old-world families. Vanderbilt smashed them open. He broke the Hudson steamboat racket wide open, dropped prices, made travel faster, made it possible for farmers, families, soldiers, immigrants to move. And when he stepped off the docks and onto the rails, he did it again, forging connections that made New York the beating heart of the nation. He laid down the backbone of the American economy, and he did it with zero patience for the slow or the soft. That ruthless drive, it built jobs, towns, entire industries. He didn't just move goods, he moved America itself. But flip the ledger. Look at the other side. Vanderbilt didn't build his empire by playing nice. He didn't invent the steamboat. He didn't lay down every mile of track with his own two hands. What he did do was find every weakness in every rival and break them. He cut fares so low that competitors went bankrupt just trying to keep up. He bribed legislators to look the other way when his tactics got too sharp. He threatened, he bluffed, he sued, he bought judges if he needed to. He treated workers as disposable parts. Union talk? Forget it. The Commodore had no patience for labor rights. If you wanted to work for Vanderbilt, you did the job his way, or you didn't do it at all. Then there's the family angle. He raised a dynasty, but he ruled it with an iron fist. Even his own children called him cold. He cut some off completely if they disappointed him. He built no public libraries like Carnegie, no universities on the scale of Rockefeller, except when prodded by his much younger second wife, Frank Crawford Vanderbilt, to toss a few million toward what became Vanderbilt University. Even that wasn't really charity, it was legacy polishing, plain and simple. Here's the part that keeps historians up at night. Maybe America needed a man like him. Maybe the frontier wasn't going to be connected by polite gentlemen in powdered wigs. Maybe it needed a man who'd bend the rules until they snapped, rip out the old guard, and ram through pro-progress with a whistle screaming overhead. Some say Vanderbilt's rise opened the door for even bigger, nastier titans. After him came Hill, Harriman, Hill, Morgan, men who played by his book, then rewrote it to be even more vicious. The age of the robber barons was born on the back of the Commodore's wake. His descendants? They spent decades fighting over his money, building marble palaces on Fifth Avenue, throwing glittering balls while the rest of the country simmered with strikes and sweatshops. By the mid-20th century, the Vanderbilts had splintered into polite high society families, old money, big names, smaller fortunes. The empire shrank while America's railways fell to highways and airplanes. The Commodore's name lives on a Tennessee university, on Vanderbilt Avenue near Grand Central, on the echo of every rumbling freight car that still snakes its way across the plains. But his spirit, it's bigger than just stone and steel. So, was he a builder or a bully? The truth, as always, is both. He built by bullying. He connected by cutting throats. He forced a young nation to grow up fast, and he got filthy rich while doing it. In the end, that's the American paradox in one top hat and a scowl. The line between progress and exploitation, between vision and greed, between building and bullying, it's not a line at all. It's a track running both ways with men like Cornelius Vanderbilt driving the locomotive. So next time you're standing under that Grand Central ceiling or you see a freight train slice through your town, tip your hat, not out of respect, but out of recognition. Because that rumble is history, still moving, still roaring forward on rails laid by men who refuse to slow down for anyone. And that, my friends, is the Commodore, a man who showed us exactly how far ambition can go when there's nothing to stop it but the grave. Thank you for riding these rails with me tonight on Faces of History. If you like this ride, subscribe, share it, and remember, every empire has a builder and a bully. Sometimes they're the same man. Stay sharp, stay questioning, and always ask who's driving the train you're on. Good night.